Dr. Goforth is a valued member of Florida Oceanographic Society's Board of Directors and also the leader of our advocacy task force. He has more than 30 years of experience in water resources engineering, operation, and program management, with 20 of those years being with the South Florida Water Management District. Now, for the past 25 years, his focus has been on large-scale environmental restoration programs in the Kissimmee Okeechobee Everglades system, and he runs his own consulting firm. Now, tonight he'll be giving us an update on the health of our waterways, as well as ongoing efforts to undo a century of environmental damages to the Everglades and our estuaries. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Gary Goforth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is truly an honor to be here. I'm going to use a portable mic because I like to move around a little bit. In case you start throwing things, I can duck and dodge. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all very much. Testing, testing. Oh, hold it close. Let me reiterate our thanks. Thank you very much for coming out and sharing our love for the river, our love for the estuary, for the Indian River Lagoon. It's because of all of you that the Florida Oceanographic Society is now celebrating almost 50 years in existence. And Mark Perry celebrating 40 years as executive director. So he just does an incredible job, and I'm a very poor substitute, but I'll do the very best I can. We're going to talk a little bit about the historic flows through the South Florida Peninsula, how some of those have been affecting the St. Lucie Estuary, the Indian River Lagoon. And then we'll also talk about the current flow. As Michelle mentioned, for over 100 years, we have been modifying the way water flows in South Florida. Historically, there was this wonderful river of grass that began near the Orlando suburbs and flowed through the Kissimmee River Valley, a beautiful, pristine, meandering river that meandered over 105 miles on its way to Lake Okeechobee. Once it moved into the lake didn't have a dike until roughly 1925, the first series of dikes. So prior to that, as the water levels would increase, the surface area of the lake would almost triple in size. It would also overflow to the south, creating our beloved Everglades. Over 100 years ago, we started modifying that system for the development of the state of Florida. And we began channelizing canals. The Kissimmee River ultimately was straightened, if you will, and we dug a ditch about 50 miles long from Lake Okeechobee to Lake Kissimmee. So instead of a 105-mile meandering, beautiful river, it was channelized into a 50-mile ditch. Fortunately, we are reversing that, and really happy to say that we're very close to restoring almost 2/3 of the river back to its beautiful, meandering, pristine state. But what has really influenced the folks around the St. Lucie Estuary more than anything is in the the early 1900s, the state of Florida decided to dig a canal and connect Lake Okeechobee to the St. Lucie Estuary. This was done for the express purpose of developing the area south of Lake Okeechobee into agriculture. And since that time, we have been sacrificed, and I say that with not to be melodramatic, but over almost 100 years, 1923, the first recorded discharges from Lake Okeechobee have been polluting the St. Lucie Estuary, sending tons of nutrients, tons and tons of sediment, which has created muck. It transformed a once pristine St. Lucie Estuary where reports were that you could take your rowboat out, where Roosevelt Bridge is today, look down about 14 feet through clear water and see the sandy bottom. Well, I guarantee you if you go out to today, you're lucky if you can see 6 inches below the surface. But that has, and the same similar channelization moving water to the west as well. In fact, the poor folks in the Caloosahatchee River and Estuary region, they actually receive almost twice as much Lake Okeechobee water as we do over here, with devastating impacts. And it's not only devastating to the estuaries, but it's a waste of a very precious resource. Overall, we're sending almost 1.7 billion gallons of water per day, and that's an average, wasting that precious resource where it could be recharging groundwater wells, it could be used for other purposes. South of the lake, the drainage systems were even more dramatic, carved out almost 1,000 square mile Everglades agricultural area, and the loss of the sawgrass. We still have what's called water conservation areas, which are remnants of the Everglades system. But in essence then, we've had tremendous effects on the South Florida ecosystem. We over here on the East Coast, and if you can see the red box, is what we are going to talk a little bit about, and that's the Indian River Lagoon. The lagoon stretches about 156 miles from just north of Cape Canaveral down south to Jupiter. In fact, we're the southern portion of the Indian River Lagoon. It is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. Over 4,000 species of plants and animals and other beings. And it is a treasure trove, not only of gold and silver coins, but of the animals that we so much cherish. As the right-hand chart, the Indian River Lagoon derives its biodiversity and some of its value because it still is influenced by the tropical weathers, the warm weather, as well as a lot of rainfall that we see down in South Florida. So again, it's a very, very diverse, very valuable ecosystem in and of itself. There are roughly 6 inlets between the ocean and the lagoon. And those inlets, for example, Jupiter Inlet, St. Lucie Inlet, Fort Pierce Inlet, are reflected in this chart, and it kind of divides a lagoon into 5 or 6 different segments for purposes of scientific study. Each of them are a little bit unique in their own way. Some fascinating stories about inlets. The St. Lucie Inlet that we have today was actually dug by hand in 1892, and then it has been maintained since that time. Prior attempts to dig it by hand failed in 1844 and again in 1855. And when I say by hand, I mean literally. Folks would get shovels and head out and try to create an open passageway. The other way to move goods and people north back in the 1800s was through the Indian River Lagoon itself. Now there were natural inlets that would open up and then close again, but the current St. Lucie Inlet has been in its present condition since about 1892. So the inlets, there's just a fascinating history on the inlets as well, and I've done it again. How about that? In addition to the drainage that we talked about a little bit earlier, the Indian River Lagoon has seen its watershed, and that's the area that contributes water and contaminants. That watershed has actually doubled in size. In fact, it's more than doubled in size as additional drainage canals were dug in South Florida. And again, these canals were dug for the development of agriculture, development of industrial, commercial, and of course, residential development as well. A little bit closer to home, the St. Lucie Estuary also experienced virtually a doubling in its drainage area or its watershed. Historically, and by that I mean back prior to 1900, we had a very kind of a narrow watershed just west of what is now the I-95 and Turnpike corridor, and that was kind of the boundary. And then the water east of that would flow into the North Fork of the St. Lucie River or the South Fork, and then into the St. Lucie Estuary. At that time, the estuary and the Indian River Lagoon in this area was predominantly freshwater. All right, so until that inlet was permanently opened, the estuary and the lagoon itself was predominantly freshwater. It was dominated by freshwater seagrasses. Is that freshwater grasses, I guess that would be. However, again, for agricultural development and residential development, Michelle, could I have a glass of water? I'm not sure I can get much longer. Anyway, so you can see our current, well, or not. There we go. So here's the old historic watershed. Now the watershed extends almost all the way to Lake Okeechobee, out past the western boundaries of Martin County and St. Lucie County into Okeechobee County as well. Currently the canals, the larger canals, I've got to stop doing that, C23 you may have heard of, C24, C44, C25 at the very north. These were all canals that were dug or enlarged by the Corps of Engineers. So in summary then, the amount of water coming into the estuary has increased tremendously, as well as everything that's picked up by that water. So with agricultural area, you see a lot of fertilizer, perhaps pesticides and herbicides, and the same thing with even the urban communities where you have fertilizers on the lawns as well as the herbicides and pesticides. The lake itself, as I mentioned, beginning in about 1923, there's been massive discharges from Lake Okeechobee, virtually filling in the lake, the St. Lucie Estuary with muck, and it's a black ooze that is very different than what it was 100 years ago. There are efforts underway to reduce the movement of that water into the estuaries, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The lake itself receives quite a bit of water from areas on the north as well as from the south and east and west. In fact, that's one thing that I like to emphasize. There's no finger pointing. The pollution of Lake Okeechobee comes from all of us that live in the Okeechobee watershed. There's no blaming one industry or the other. But as scientists and engineers, we have to know where the sources of these pollution are so we can solve them. So sometimes it does come out, if we say that so much percent of the pollution comes from agricultural lands. Again, it's not to point fingers, but it's to identify how best to solve the problem. The units we're looking at cover the period January through October of 2018, and the yellow boxes reflect water volumes in billion gallons. And so for that 9-month period, roughly a little over 500 billion gallons of water came into Lake Okeechobee, massive amounts of water. And of that, almost 100 billion gallons was sent to the St. Lucie Estuary as part of what's called the Lake Okeechobee regulation releases. As I mentioned earlier, the Caloosahatchee actually sees almost twice, in this case more than twice, the amount of volume of water that the St. Lucie Estuary gets. And in addition to the water itself, it contains a lot of nutrients. And the nutrients that that we deal with are phosphorus and nitrogen. These are the same elements that you add to your lawn to keep them green and grow plants and other vegetation. However, in a lake environment and an estuarine environment, too much of a good thing can cause a lot of problems. And so what we're seeing is the lake itself is extremely polluted. In fact, in 2017, it received the largest amount of nutrients in history. Over 2 million pounds of phosphorus was moved into Lake Okeechobee. And so naturally then, the nutrients, the pollution that's in the lake ends up being discharged to the estuaries as well as discharged south. And so the numbers reflect, for example, over 162,000 pounds of phosphorus came into our estuary from Lake Okeechobee, 3.3 million pounds of nitrogen from Lake Okeechobee, and then what really is dramatic is over 35 million pounds of sediment. And this is the black muck that we see. If you've seen aerial photographs of the St. Lucie Inlet after a big storm, you see this horrendous plume of dark water leaving the estuary. And it's a legacy of over almost 100 years of discharging water from Lake Okeechobee containing a very, very high amount of muck. Of that 500 billion gallons that entered the lake, roughly 100 billion gallons was used as water supply for the EAA, the Everglades Agricultural Area. And again, and also about 100 billion gallons went south to the Everglades. So historically, roughly all 500 billion gallons would have gone to the Everglades. And now with all the alterations that we've made, only about 20% of that makes its way to the Everglades. And as a result, the Everglades is suffering from dry conditions. Florida Bay, you probably heard about, is also suffering just simply not getting enough water, and they're having major problems with their seagrass die-offs because the salinity is just getting too high to sustain a healthy ecosystem. I am getting pretty good at that. Almost 25 years ago, the state of Florida embarked on a major water pollution control program, and that was referred to as the Everglades program, in fact. In fact, when I was with the Water Management District, I was involved in the planning, design, and operation of what we call stormwater treatment areas. These are constructed wetlands that we built along the southern boundary of the EAA. So these are these orange polygons, and they actually capture the stormwater runoff from the EAA, which is predominantly sugar, as well as lake water, and it treats it. So it takes this dirty, filthy water, actually cleans it up quite nicely. And so the big difference then, as the water moves south from Lake Okeechobee, virtually every drop is treated before it goes into the Everglades, compared with no water is treated before it goes to the estuaries. And so very, very different quality of water. Also, starting around the mid-1990s, the state and federal government started working together to develop a comprehensive plan to try to correct all the problems that we've talked about from the alterations. We wanted to develop a series of programs to improve the quality of water, the quantity of water, the timing of when that water makes its way south or east or west, as well as the distribution of those waters. And as a result, we came up with what's referred to as a Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or SERP is what we refer to it as. And that was initially authorized in the year 2000, 19 years ago, or a little over 18 years ago, I guess it was, that project. And the program as a whole contains 68 components, and these components include vegetated wetlands, like we've talked about, or constructed wetlands for treatment of water. It includes reservoirs. It includes a pumping program called aquifer storage and recovery. And this is a technique and a technology where you have high flows, where you pump them down into the ground, but then retrieve that water later on as you need it. And it's a proven technology in certain geologic areas, and so those referred to as ASR wells. Now that's very different from what you've heard people talk about deep injection wells. Deep injection wells are bad. Deep injection wells it's a losing proposition. It takes that water, which is again a precious resource, and sends it down a hole, and forever it's gone. We don't really understand where that water might end up, but it's a very costly way to get rid of a precious resource. And again, it's almost contrary to this whole effort to try to improve the quality and the quantity of water that SERP is all about. The 68 projects each have project descriptions and schedules associated with them. The Corps of Engineers is the primary federal agency responsible for designing and building these projects, and they maintain a very current website containing schedules and descriptions of the projects as well. So for details, I'd refer you to the Corps of Engineers, their Jacksonville district. Just type in SERP, and you'll have a plethora of information about these wonderful projects. One of them, by the way, is being constructed just west of us. It's called the C-44 Reservoir and Stormwater Treatment Area. And that project will serve to capture stormwater runoff from the C-44 canal. That's also known as the St. Lucie Canal. That's that man-made connection between the lake and the estuary. And that reservoir will capture that water, treat it through an adjacent stormwater treatment area prior to then discharging it into the St. Lucie Estuary. So that's a wonderful project, and it's being accelerated courtesy of the South Florida Water Management District. They've actually gone out ahead of the Corps of Engineers and decided to implement, build it quicker than the Corps by itself. So we're looking forward to that project coming online in the next couple of years. There's two other projects that are very relevant for our purposes. Both of them help improve the amount of water moving south to the Everglades, and in turn reduces the destructive Lake Okeechobee discharges to our estuaries. And these are the Everglades Agricultural Area Storage Reservoirs. There's two of them, and so we name one A1 and the other A2. It reminds me of the Cat in the Hat, the Dr. Seuss stories. But nevertheless, there are two projects. One of them is already complete. It's about a 15,000 acre shallow reservoir. And so the Water Management District holds water to about 4 feet deep. And that's been very helpful in moving additional lake water to the south. The new one is referred to as A2. And this is the EAA storage reservoir that Senator Negron was instrumental in moving forward and moving through the state legislature. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. That you may remember what was referred to as SB 10. That was the legislation that Senator Negron championed as part of the EAA Storage Reservoir project. And that project is being accelerated by Governor DeSantis, and we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. There's a lot written on the EAA storage reservoir, and we're very excited to see that going. That should reduce the discharges to the estuary by roughly anywhere from 25 to 50% over the long term. On years with rather small releases, it should capture 100% of those lake discharges, so the estuary would see several years without any lake discharges. So these are very, very helpful projects for the quality of the St. Lucie estuary. The lake itself, as I mentioned, is very, very polluted, and it also has a series of projects identified to improve the quality of the water entering the lake, as well as the kind of improving the storage north of Lake Okeechobee. And this whole package of projects for the lake is referred to as the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project. So a lot of activity by the state and federal governments north of the lake. Now this I apologize, it's a little busy. This is, we're gonna start, the next 2 or 3 slides are gonna be a little bit busy, I apologize in advance. But in many ways it's appropriate because we're gonna talk about the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. And that is a very complex schedule. The lake itself is a beautiful lake. It's one of the largest in North America. I think it's the second largest in the contiguous United States. And it has a very beautiful ecosystem unto itself, the wading birds, the other plants and animals. So there's a value in maintaining the health of Lake Okeechobee as an intrinsic water body. But the lake also serves as a major water supply reservoir for communities and agricultural around the lake. And so there are multiple and many times conflicting objectives on how you manage Lake Okeechobee. Some of the objectives, like the water supply objective, says, well, keep as much water in the lake as you can so we can use it during the dry season. Well, that conflicts with a concern about sending water to the estuaries, because if the water gets too high during the rainy season, the Corps of Engineers has to make these massive releases. So the estuary folks say, well, no, let's keep that water level down as low as possible to try to minimize the amount of water being sent to the estuary. And then the lake itself has a kind of a band of just a few feet of optimal levels for the lake into itself. And so the Corps and the state of Florida have developed a complex set of algorithms to try to manage the multiple, often competing objectives of Lake Okeechobee. And it's described by the Corps themselves as a war book. In other words, there's always battles over the operation of the lake. But the Lake Okeechobee Regulation Schedule, we affectionately refer to it as LORS, L-O-R-S, tries to balance those competing objectives. And in order to do so, it establishes certain bands of where, ideally the lake stage, and when I say the stage of a lake, that's the water level of the lake. Try to keep that stage within a certain band that's beneficial for the lake itself. And ideally then, the lake stage, the water level, should be about 12.5 feet at the beginning of the wet season. And we like it that low because once the rains begin, it can quickly overpower the ability to lower the lake, okay? So often what you see, in fact, we saw it during I'm sure you remember the May of 2018. It rained, I think, every day. And the lake went up very, very quickly. And hence that on June 1st, because the rate of increase was so steep, and we were just beginning the wet season, the Corps, through the algorithms of the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, had to start making massive releases to the estuaries, both the St. Lucie Estuary and the Caloosahatchee. In fact, those discharges lasted, I think, about 127 days or something like that. Well, that's very helpful. Let's see, that's also confusing. Maybe this is another one. And there will be a quiz following. Michelle's going to hand out the quizzes afterwards. But in essence, there are the algorithms to decide how much water should be sent south to the water conservation areas and how much water should be sent to the estuaries. And it depends on everything from what day of the year it is to how much rain we've had in the last 30 days to the projected rainfall in the next 30 days, where the lake stage is relative to the ideal for the lake itself. So it's a very complex set of algorithms, and the Corps and primarily the South Florida Water Management District are responsible for moving water out of the lake to achieve those competing objectives. We have an opportunity, and this is where I'm going to put on my advocacy hat and encourage every one of you to come out on February 19th. There are 2 meetings the Corps of Engineers is hosting, and they're going to be held at the Indian River State College at 1 o'clock and then again at 6 o'clock. The Corps is beginning the re-evaluation of the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. So this is our opportunity as members of the public to voice our concerns. And I can tell you, having gone through this process multiple times in the past, the current process by the Corps of Engineers, and I used the word once before, I'll use it again, sacrifices those of us in the estuaries. We're in many ways outside their project boundary. They're concerned with protecting the integrity of the Herbert Hoover Dike and protecting the welfare and the economic values of those folks that live south of Lake Okeechobee. And one reason they do that is their legislative duty. That's what they were brought in initially back in the 1920s and 1930s to do, and that was to build a dike and operate Lake Okeechobee for the benefit of the areas south of Lake Okeechobee. We have been collateral damage, if you will, and for almost 100 years, we've been sacrificed. So now is our opportunity to stand up in front of the Corps of Engineers. We each get 2 minutes and share a story that it affects us all personally, that these discharges affect us economically. A 2015 Florida Realtors report indicated that there was almost $1 billion in lost real estate with every single large lake event between our estuary and Caloosahatchee. $1 billion. Corps of Engineers does not include that in their evaluation. The Corps of Engineers also doesn't include the environmental damage wrought by these discharges, and with respect to the amount of muck that smothers the seagrasses. You're gonna be hard pressed to find any seagrass in the St. Lucie Estuary or the southern Indian River Lagoon. And most of us realize the value of a healthy seagrass population. That's where the small fish and crustaceans can hide from predators. It's a value in and of itself. The seagrass filters seawater and cleans the water from pollution. Multiple benefits, and that muck just smothers up that seagrass. And most recently, we're finding out the harmful effects of toxic blue-green algae. And this is the source of this algae is a very polluted Lake Okeechobee. And there's many types of blue-green algae, and in fact, this type, even though it's called blue-green algae, is really a bacteria, but for the purposes of this, we'll call it a blue-green algae because that's what everybody calls it. This particular algae is toxic, and particularly, it's a freshwater algae, and so it only survives in freshwater, and it only survives in the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries as a result of these large discharges from Lake Okeechobee. And as the algae itself dies, it releases a very toxic element called microcystis. And microcystis most recently has been implicated in both short-term as well as long-term public health problems. And these range of short-term effects, everything from gastrointestinal problems, respiratory problems, but just as alarming are the long-term, the chronic effects. The area of the Indian River Lagoon, the southern Indian River Lagoon, has one of the highest cases of liver cancer. And studies have shown the relationship between the liver cancers and this toxin. Also linkage to Alzheimer's and dementia and ALS. These are very serious medical conditions that the Corps of Engineers simply ignores. And so it's incumbent on every one of us to stand up and share 2 minutes with the Corps of Engineers on February 19th and suggesting that they, number one, their goal, our goal, my goal personally and professionally, stop the discharges. That's the end game, is stop the discharge of Lake Okeechobee water into the St. Lucie Estuary. And so again, that's on February 19th, we have an opportunity to influence the Corps of Engineers as they reevaluate that Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. And I could talk for hours on that subject, but that'll be another day. Well, here we go. Here we talk about the Cyanobacteria. That's the official name for the blue-green algae. In July 2nd of last year, who's doing that? That's me. I'll draw your attention to this chart. July 2nd, over 90% of the open water of Lake Okeechobee was covered in toxic blue-green algae. These are satellite images. I've seen it personally. Your visible eye, you see a neon green. And this is the same neon green that many of you saw on our waterways as this was being discharged from Lake Okeechobee. The largest in history. And as I mentioned, just that prior year, we had the largest amount of pollution going into Lake Okeechobee. Currently, the Corps of Engineers ignores this. So even though they knew that the discharges were toxic, I go back to the word I used before, we were sacrificed. We were given that toxic, polluted water. We being the estuary communities, the Fort Myers, Caloosahatchee Estuary, as well as the St. Lucie Estuary. So again, that's why the importance of sharing with the Corps that their evaluation should hold our public health as important as the public health of the people south of the lake. Our economy should be held as important as the economy of the folks south of Lake Okeechobee. Our environment should be held at least the same level of importance as the environment south of Lake Okeechobee. Currently, the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule does not balance it out. We're the ones that get sacrificed. The algae bloom is monitored by the state agencies. There's some question on, are they measuring in the right locations and quick enough? I think Governor DeSantis is going to improve the situation, but there are a lot of samples being collected. This is a chart between May and October of last year showing the volumes of water coming into the St. Lucie Estuary. And the dark blue on the bottom represents the amount of polluted Lake Okeechobee water that was being sent to the St. Lucie Estuary. The other shades and the other colors represent runoff from our local basin. And our local basins, we talked about the C23, C24, C44, those also are polluted. I mean, please understand that. The water quality throughout the St. Lucie Estuary watershed is poor. Ironically, and perhaps not, but the best water quality entering the St. Lucie Estuary is right around us. In other words, the tidally influenced areas, predominantly the urban communities, have the highest and best water quality of any that enters Lake Okeechobee, even with all of our septic tanks. And septic tanks are a part of the problem, and it's excellent that the St. Lucie and Martin County governments have already converted over 8,000 septic tanks to centralized sewers, and there's plans to do a lot more. So that's a good thing. Now, not all septic tanks are bad. If you're living several miles away from the river on an area where there's several feet between the ground surface and the water table, those are fine. But my point is, we're all part of the problem. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone in particular. So this is what it looks like. And you notice that the blue lake discharges are in pulses. And I really want to give credit to Mark Perry. Mark, on a weekly basis, Mark and others meet with the Corps of Engineers during these discharges, evaluating and giving some feedback. And Mark said, for the health of the estuary, allow us a couple of days a week, 2 days a week, without these lake discharges. And the Corps agreed. So what we have now are 5 days of discharges and 2 days of downtime. And this is very, very important. And it's turned out that it's really helped some of the organisms that just simply can't get out of the way of the discharges, like oysters. I mean, oysters are pretty much fixed in space. And so the Corps now has adopted this pulse release for the lake discharge, and I really want to give Mark credit for that. We talked about some of the environmental impacts to the, certainly to the human health, the loss of the seagrass beds, which has been dramatic, and it's also long-term effects. We still don't know the full impacts of the loss of our seagrasses. Where are the juvenile sea turtles gonna hide? As well as most of the sport fish that we love to fish use these seagrass beds as a refugia during their young life. We've talked about some of the human health impacts and then the economic impacts. I haven't even mentioned loss of hotel reservations, loss of income if you happen to have a bait shop or a tackle shop or a paddleboard rental shop. Well, there's not a lot of people going to be wanting to rent your paddle boards when we've got guacamole green on the surface of the estuary. And in fact, this last summer, Sanibel Island on the West Coast, they did a very detailed economic impact. Through the first 3 months, actually, I'm sorry, let's say 6 months of the discharges, they documented in terms of lost hotel reservations and loss of business income, $50 million for a 6-month period of time. Again, the Corps doesn't consider that, but we need to make sure they do the next time around. So there's economic impacts, the human health impacts, the oyster reefs, we'll talk about that in just a little bit, the seagrass beds, and even the nearshore coral reefs. Those of you that dive, either scuba dive or skin dive, we're at the kind of the northern extreme of one of the largest contiguous coral reefs in the world. Our reef system begins about the St. Lucie Inlet and heads all the way down to the Florida Keys. And that is being adversely impacted by the discharge of the muck, the nutrient-laden water, the algae itself is actually wreaking havoc on those nearshore reefs. We don't talk about that as much as we probably should. Let's talk about oysters a little bit. Oysters are an amazing little animal. Number one, each single oyster can filter about 50 gallons of water per day and clean it up. Isn't that amazing? They taste good too. And yet they have a very low tolerance for fresh water. In other words, there's a salinity range that they really like to survive in. And with all these releases from Lake Okeechobee, that fresh water lowers the salinity down into zones that are simply not healthy at all. It can stress them, it can harm them long term, and then cause ultimate death. And so this is what we monitor very closely. As I mentioned earlier, that the Corps has adopted a pulse release system, and we've seen an incredible, almost a 50% improvement in the oyster health because of the pulse releases. So this is something we continue to monitor as well. The seagrass we talked about, even 2010, just 8 short years ago, you could see a lot of healthy seagrass. You go out there today, and as I mentioned, you'd be hard-pressed to find a healthy seagrass bed. And this does not bode well for the future. Don't have to tell many of you what the place looked like last year. And in addition to the horrific visual, it had a horrific stench to it as well. And quite frankly, we could probably expect to see this anytime we have these large lake releases, because the lake itself, as I mentioned, is horribly polluted and will continue to be polluted for the time being. And so when we have these lake releases, I suspect we'll be seeing a lot more, unfortunately, of the cyanobacteria, or the blue-green algae. As I mentioned, the Caloosahatchee also receives its share, in fact, twice as much water as we get on the East Coast. They also have a kind of a double whammy of red tide. Now, red tide is a naturally occurring phenomenon at low concentrations, okay? At the concentrations that we see now, it is not a natural phenomenon, and it's fed by the nutrients that are discharged from the Lake Okeechobee, as well as most of the rivers up and down the coast of Florida. And so we actually, this year, we saw, or actually 2018, red tide along the East Coast. And that's a very rare phenomenon. And it was the same red tide that started on the West Coast. It actually got caught up in the Gulf Stream and moved around the Florida Keys and came all the way up the East Coast. And that's only happened 5 or 6 times in the last 50 years, just to give you an indication of the magnitude of the red tide this past year. And so red tide, those of you that experienced it here, there were several beaches were closed. I think both Martin County and St. Lucie County, they called their lifeguards in because there's almost immediate respiratory impacts. Our staff at the Florida Oceanographic on a daily basis go check certain activities along the beach, and they simply would walk over the sand dune and they had to turn around. It creates, the red tide creates a very quick and acute respiratory problem. So the Caloosahatchee had been facing red tide for over 1.5 years, and right in the middle of that, here comes the Lake Okeechobee and blue-green algae. So they really got a double dose. The Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission monitors and actually reports on red tide. I get a twice weekly email letting them know the status of it. And this year, or I say this year, 2018, the red tide that originated in this area worked its way all the way up to the far western extremes of the state of Florida, as well as I mentioned, it worked itself around the east coast of the state of Florida as well. So we go back to our end game, our goal is to stop the discharges to the St. Lucie Estuary. We talked about the desired flow is back to the River of Grass, help return additional flow to Florida Bay, reduce the discharges to the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee as well. We are cautiously optimistic with Governor DeSantis. He, during the campaign, he came out very strong in favor of several policies that would improve the water quality and the environment in South Florida. And I'm very happy to say that right out of the blocks, he has been not only walking the walk, but talking the talk. His very first executive order made it clear that he was serious about protecting the environment in the state of Florida. There were 5 major points. One is he dedicated $2.5 billion for continued Everglades restoration, which is, I think that's about $1 billion more than the prior administration in that same period of time. He is establishing a blue-green algal task force. And this is something that will help focus the research throughout the state on the causes as well as the impacts of harmful algae blooms. He also directed the South Florida Water Management District to accelerate the planning, the design, and the construction of that EAA storage reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee, which is going to very measurably help our estuary. He created an Office of Environmental accountability and transparency. And I'm very excited to see this be implemented. And they've been charged with organizing and directing an integrated scientific research throughout the state of Florida. So that is certainly welcomed. And the appointment of a chief scientific officer. There had been one, in the 1980s, I think, but not since that time has the state of Florida had a single individual or a single office that will be directing scientific research throughout the state of Florida. So these are wonderful measures that the governor is moving forward on, and we're certainly thankful to see that. I do want to mention we've had very good kind of bipartisan effort in the House of Representatives. Congressman Mast has been working across the aisle with others to help introduce legislation at the federal level to kind of force the Corps of Engineers to recognize the public health impacts of blue-green algae, as well as to improve the monitoring of blue-green algae and the notification of folks when algae is identified in Lake Okeechobee releases. So both at the state and federal level, I think there's reason to be cautiously optimistic. And I think we're close to wrapping up. Yes, the Water Management District. Governor DeSantis, one of the first things he did after his election was called for the resignation of the 9 members of the governing board of the South Florida Water Management District. And as of today, I think 7 out of the 9 have resigned. He's made 2 appointments, and both of them have been very good. Chauncey Goss from the West Coast, as well as Alligator Ron Bergeron. Alligator Ron is a wonderful individual, has got a lot of experience in state level, both water quality and environmental protection. I'm anxious to see both of them in their new roles. Here at the Florida Oceanographic Society, we have a pledge, Save Our Waters pledge. It's something, it's simple, but it helps us remind ourselves every day, and we encourage each and every one of you to get a copy of this at the back table and sign our pledge. It helps you educate other people. In fact, one of the objectives, one of the mission statements of the Florida Oceanographic Society is to instill the stewardship through education, research, and advocacy, so that we can then reach out to our neighbors and educate our neighbors on the importance of understanding the water quality and the movement of water in our estuary. And the Save Our Waters pledge identifies things that we can do on a daily basis and even helping our neighbors as well. So take a minute before you leave and pick up a copy and then sign our pledge. I do want to mention one thing about the volunteers at the Florida Oceanographic Society, and I see a lot of them out here today. God bless you all. We have, I think, on the order of 250 or so volunteers, and this past 2018, they contributed almost 18,000 hours of time, of their very valuable time. So I want to thank you all, the volunteers. Right. And we have room for more, so we encourage you, if you want to come out and volunteer. We've got some wonderful programs that engage children as well as adults. And I think I've pretty well done it. So thank you all very much. And